Hi, welcome to a celebration of Nantucket Sound, our monthly webinar series. I'm Audra Parker. I'm the president and CEO of the Alliance to Protect Nantucket Sound. And for those of you who don't know us, we're an environmental nonprofit organization based in Hyannis, Massachusetts, here on Cape Cod. And we are dedicated to the long-term protection and preservation of Nantucket Sound, which is the body of water that lies between Cape Cod, Nantucket, and Martha's Vineyard. So with this series, we hope to provide you with an in-depth view of just what makes Nantucket Sound so extraordinary from an environmental standpoint, a historic standpoint, tribal standpoint, and the importance of its economic contribution to the region. So I'd like to show you why the protection and preservation of Nantucket Sound is critical by looking at a map of this unique body of water. And if you look at this here, you can see that in the dark blue, you have federal waters in the center of the sound, and those are unprotected and open to development, while the state waters that are in light blue extend 3 miles from the shorelines of Cape Cod, Nantucket, and Martha's Vineyard, and are protected by a state law called the Massachusetts Ocean Sanctuaries Act. So the Alliance, along with a very broad and strong coalition of stakeholders, has been working on getting federal legislation enacted to protect this unique body of water. This coalition includes local municipalities, tribal entities, chambers of commerce, environmental groups, renewable energy developers, and many, many others. The federal legislation is called the Nantucket Sound National Historic Landmark Act, and it would essentially do 3 things. First of all, it would designate Nantucket Sound as a National Historic Landmark, as the name implies, and that is the highest level of historic protection possible. And to give you an example, the entire island of Nantucket has that designation as a National Historic Landmark. And this form of marine protection is different than a national marine sanctuary, different than a national monument, in that it doesn't confer any kind of federal authority or federal oversight by federal agencies such as NOAA. It is a designation that does not come with additional regulations and burdens, and yet protects existing uses like commercial fishing and recreation. So in addition to designating Nantucket Sound as a National Historic Landmark, it would improve the consistencies between those protections that I mentioned under the state law, the Massachusetts Ocean Sanctuaries Act, and the lack of protection in the federal waters in the center, and really manage it as one single ecosystem as it is. And thirdly, as we've done a lot of stakeholder outreach over the last few years, spoken to environmental groups, spoken to individuals, spoken to fishing groups, we've added important environmental protections to the bill so that we can address issues that we're seeing facing Nantucket Sound, like diminished water quality, algae blooms, coastal erosion, degradation habitat and such. So in short, it's a very broad-based bill. It would be very good for Nantucket Sound and very good for the Cape and Islands. And some good news recently, in the late fall, the National Congress of American Indians passed a resolution recognizing the importance of Nantucket Sound from a tribal perspective and supporting protecting Nantucket Sound as a sacred site. So without using up all the time, because I know everyone's anxious to hear Greg speak about Shipwrecks, let me just introduce him. So Greg Ketchen is a retired U.S. Coast Guard captain who lives on Cape Cod. He is a volunteer at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum in Barnstable and serves as its president. He was a Coast Guard officer for 27 years, head of search and rescue policies on the faculty of the Coast Guard Academy, and commanded Group Boston as well as a NATO station in Italy. So tonight, Greg will discuss the history and causes of shipwrecks in Nantucket Sound, marine emergency response efforts, and the origins of the Coast Guard's search and rescue mission. So before Greg comes on, I just want you to know that the video capacity is off, so you'll only see me and Greg. I will get off. Greg will speak for a half an hour about shipwrecks, show you some great visuals, and then I'll come back on to facilitate questions from the audience. So we'll hold the questions to the end, but you're welcome to submit them throughout while Greg's talking. So with that, welcome, Greg, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Let me turn on the slide presentation here. Technology is always the first hurdle.
Well, I will get off so that I will not be obstructing you in any way.
Okay, I think we're set. Thank you, Audrey, for that introduction. And thank you to all of you that have joined us this evening. Good evening. Audrey gave you some of my background, and my interest in shipwrecks is real as a historian, as an oceanographer, as a Coast Guard officer. I'm going to be talking about shipwrecks tonight. Frankly, shipwrecks are not a real pleasant topic. They're interesting, but often lead to significant property damage, death, injury, but we learn from them. And I'm going to talk about that this evening, about how they affect Nantucket Sound particularly, although I'm going to, in context, talk outside of Nantucket Sound some too. There have been many books written on shipwrecks. There is several films, a song, the Edmund Fitzgerald, some of you old enough to remember that, from the 1970s. Films such as The Perfect Storm, Finest Hours, The Titanic, all deal with shipwrecks. So it's an interesting topic, although I don't want to glorify it. Certainly when it occurs, usually it affects the captain's career significantly, if not ending a career, and has other very detrimental impacts. But the key is that we learn from each time we have a serious mishap on the ocean, and I'll be talking about that. Actually, this picture is not Nantucket Sound, as you can probably guess. It's frankly, and full disclosure, it's the on the west coast off Oregon. It's just a nice picture of a shipwreck. We have many similar shipwrecks here on or near the Cape, around Nantucket, and I want to provide some disclaimers at first here. If those of you who have interest in shipwrecks have been on the island, on the Cape for 10 years or so, you may remember Bill Quinn. He was a quintessential Cape Cod shipwreck historian. He was a photographer, an author, and most importantly, a photojournalist. And to say he wrote the book would be appropriate. He's written many, many books on shipwrecks around Cape Cod. Some fantastic photographs. So if you're interested, looking for one of Bill's books, we lost him about 8 or 9 years ago, at the ripe old age of 87, but he's still remembered. I don't purport to be Bill Quinn. My ability to photograph as an example of, this is my one picture of a shipwreck I'm particularly fond of. It's attractive because it's easily get off here and play some miniature golf and maybe get a soft ice cream, that sort of thing. But I have borrowed from other people to give some credence to this talk with some real photographs of shipwrecks. I know that some of you who have come to these lectures in the past year or two know that last summer there was a presentation on shipwrecks in Nantucket Sound. It was a summary inventory. I'm not going to go through the complete inventory. I'm not trying to repeat myself. And there are many people that give talks on shipwrecks, such as, well, Don Wildman does an excellent job on shipwrecks, and many others. But I'm going to come at it from a different perspective, from my career as a Coast Guard officer, looking at how we've adjusted our responses to shipwrecks, how we've worked to prevent shipwrecks if all we can, although you'll learn as we go through here. Certainly preventing them completely is a challenge, and we haven't even come close to getting there yet. I'm going to give you a little, a little advertisement here for a second. As Audra mentioned, I am at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum. It's on 6A in Barnstable. For those that haven't been there, I strongly encourage you to come by. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. This is much more than a man cave with a few patches in someone's uniform from 1950. It has some significant artifacts. I won't go into them right today, but please stop by. I think you'll be very impressed. It is an institution that's been around for 17 years now. We just completed our 17th year, and It's run all by volunteers. We have a few paid staff, like an accountant, a bookkeeper, and that sort of thing, but it is volunteers, and the majority of the volunteers are retired military, primarily Coast Guard. We're very proud of that, but certainly interested in anyone getting involved. If you're interested in coming over or helping donate financially, all our funding comes from donations. We have been in the black every year, so we're proud of that. We have several outbuildings. It's a whole campus. On this picture on the left-hand side is the oldest wooden jail in the United States, built in 1695, give or take. And then an operating blacksmith shop in our carriage house. And we're doing some other things outside. It's a great facility. So please feel free to stop by or donate. Frankly, love anything. Donate, not just money, time and experience or stories. We're very interested in collecting stories. Our goal is to tell the Coast Guard story from the Cape Cod perspective. And I hope to do that tonight. The two are very closely linked. And that's the reason I'm here tonight, is to talk about shipwrecks from a Coast Guard perspective and from a Cape Cod perspective. Having said that, one last shot inside the museum. This is just one model, just on a side. This model took the model maker 25 years to make. It's spectacular, but it's one of many models at the museum. Okay, let me get to the Coast Guard a little bit. This is a very short history. I'll keep this very short also. The Coast Guard began back in the 18th century, late 1700s, just after the country was formed, actually. 1790 was the start of the second year of Washington's first administration. We were in the Treasury Department under Hamilton, and up and through until 1969, when we became part of the new Transportation Department, and then finally moved over to Homeland Security after 9/11. There's also been a number of organizations, this is only a partial list, that have been merged with the Coast Guard, starting with a Revenue Cutter Service and a Life-Saving Service. They merged together in 1915 to become the Coast Guard. The name Coast Guard was adopted then, although we clearly got a history going back to the 1700s. The Lighthouse Service joined later in 1939. Again, its origins go back to the 1789 for the Lighthouse Service itself, but I'll show you a little bit more on that in just a second. And then as bureaucratic as it sounds, the Bureau of Marine Inspection sounds like another federal agency, but it was significant. It led to all the marine safety stuff the Coast Guard does now, the licensing of captains, the inspection of life rafts, all the safety stuff and rules and regulations that go along with marine safety. Put this up, one last thing on these elements of the Coast Guard. Massachusetts, and I assume many of you are Massachusetts residents, Cape Cod residents. Massachusetts is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. The Revenue Cutter Service, the first Revenue Cutter was the Revenue Cutter Massachusetts, built in 1791 up in Newburyport and homeported in Boston. The Life-Saving Service, the origins of Life-Saving Service date back to the Mass Humane Society, which started in the 1780s. I won't go out. That's a whole nother lecture on that particular organization, how it evolved into the U.S. Life-Saving Service and then became part of the Coast Guard. And I mentioned the U.S. Lighthouse Service in 1789, but frankly, the oldest lighthouse goes much further back than that, Boston Light from 1716. And many lighthouses on the Cape go back to the 18th century also. So we have a proud history here in Cape Cod. We are the only standing museum, a freestanding museum in the country, in this part of the country. There's another one in Seattle, Fred Herzberg, we have a very close relationship with, has another museum for the Coast Guard in there in the city of Seattle. And then there's a national museum proposed. Enough on that. Let me move on. Oh, wait a minute. This is a picture I have, gives you some orientation. I put this on because when I had command of Group Boston, this was sort of my, what they called AOR, area of responsibility. It stretched out to the New York border and stretched down closer to Cape Cod. But the red arrows shown there, this is a map from 1790, but I put the red arrows on or photoshopped them in to show the Life-Saving Service, the Lighthouse Service, and the Revenue Cutter Service all began here. The red arrows point to that. Shipwrecks go back in my family quite a ways. This is the Princess Kathleen. Again, an example of why we have shipwrecks. What are the causes of shipwrecks, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Kathleen, radar wasn't working and made some navigational errors, ran aground off the coast of Alaska and sank with my great-grandfather on board. Fortunately, he was able to get off. He was in his early 80s, and everyone else got off safely through efforts of the Coast Guard up there, got them on shore, very remote part of Cape Cod, of Cape Cod, of Alaska, got them ashore safely, and they got back into some metropolitan areas after that. But that was my first introduction to Shipwrecks. Personally, was the Princess Kathleen, a very new vessel, reasonably capable crew, except that they ran aground. Another tie to my life, and hopefully to many of yours, if you've been in Cape Cod for a while, this is intentionally a blurry vision of the Longstreet. Longstreet was moved up to Cape Cod in 1945 after it had served during World War II briefly as a Liberty ship taking cargo back and forth to Europe, made one trip actually. Had a damage during a major storm outside of New York City off Sandy Hook, and was eventually moved up here after the war to use as a target ship. I think that anyone who has been here prior to the mid-1990s remember the target ship out there. It's still there, frankly. It appears on spring low tides, very low tides, but it slipped down, and there isn't much left of it at this point. But it was also a shipwreck in a pure sense. But my other introduction is to Nantucket Sound. Right now, I'm in Osterville. Living in Osterville, our beach is Dows's Beach, which looks out on Nantucket Sound when we're down there several times a week. My first experience with the Coast Guard, I'll digress just for a second. I got attracted to the Coast Guard because my experiences on Cape Cod as a kid growing up, spending summers here, and attracted to oceanography and attracted to the Coast Guard. After I got to the Coast Guard Academy, I spent 3 summers on the Coast Guard Cutter Eagle, some of those spent going through Nantucket Sound. When I got into the Coast Guard, I'll just mention the Coast Guard one last time here as far as what they're about, except I'll emphasize a little bit what I did in the Coast Guard just to provide some credibility and from a shipwreck perspective. All the stuff here, I won't go through the whole list. On the right-hand side, though, is the HLS stands for Homeland Security, are the missions we have that are not directly related to Homeland Security. And 2 that I'm going to be talking about tonight are search and rescue, SAR, AIDS navigation, and a little bit of marine safety too. So that said, I point out this is just a quick synopsis and a very small sampling of my career. I did not have a particularly unusual career. I'm very proud of what happened. We had a lot of challenges, a lot of rewards. It was a great career from my perspective. Had on a ship, the bottom left corner is a ship that is, I'm going to just turn on my pointer here, a ship that was up in Newcastle, New Hampshire. This is the Coast Guard Cutter Active. I spent a lot of time out east of Cape Cod patrolling fisheries, some trips through Nantucket Sound and Buzzards Bay. Up in the upper left-hand corner was a second tour of mine at a command of a small NATO station that was a navigation station serving the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean. Some of these things you would be surprised are part of the Coast Guard. We think of Coast Guard, most people, as small boats and helicopters going out and rescue people. Certainly that's an important part. Up in the upper right-hand corner is related to a shipwreck indirectly too. This is myself. I'm not the one highlighted in the background there, far back. This is surveying glaciers up on the west coast of Greenland. I went up there 4 times doing surveys of glaciers. Why would the Coast Guard be surveying glaciers, one might ask? It all relates to the Titanic. When the Titanic sank, the Coast Guard took over. The International Ice Patrol was formed a year after the Titanic sank. And since that time, we've been operating Ice Patrol, tracking icebergs. So we're up in Greenland looking at the production of icebergs. And there has been no vessel, transatlantic vessel, that has hit an iceberg since the Titanic. We take pride in the fact that we've been that successful to let people know what the icebergs are. The lower right corner are some of my other jobs. This isn't all work. Sometimes this is the Schooner Fest up in Boothbay Harbor, Maine. We deal with the schooners, but deal with recreational boats, commercial boats, all sorts of things. The middle one is my experience in Washington, D.C. I was the head of the search and rescue policy program in Washington, D.C., and a study on small boat stations in Washington, D.C. too, there for 5 years. Great place to be. No desire to go back at this point, but I like being on Cape Cod. I was also on that glacier survey I showed a picture of before. It was on an icebreaker, excuse me, for several summers. We would take helicopters in, land close to the glaciers and do surveys. One of the surveys we're doing was with the icebreaker, we're looking for what was called a sill at the mouth of the fjords to determine how deep the water was there. Usually it was 60, 70, 80 feet at minimum, usually much deeper than that, to determine how large of a iceberg could come out of the fjord. Obviously, if the depth of water is 60 feet, you can't get an iceberg out of there that's more than 60 feet deep, or only when it's less than that. Well, we're looking for that sill. Unfortunately, we found a sill that was only about 10 feet deep, and we ran hard aground at a good speed. They said going aground isn't a pleasant experience. In this case, we were uncharted water. No one was injured, although a lot of people were thrown to the deck. The only major issue we had, we punched a hole in a hull, but it's a double hull, so we didn't sink. It took quite a while to get off, a day or so to get off. The only major disaster we had is one of the compartments that flooded was the compartment that had all the toilet paper on board. So we had to improvise for a while until we got new supplies of that in. Anyway, let me mention something else in my Coast Guard career. There are good days and there are bad days. Frankly, most of these were good days. Some of the bad days related to shipwrecks, disasters. One that particularly comes to mind, I spent part of my career, as I mentioned, alluded to, in Boston. Maybe I didn't allude to that. I had command of Group Boston. One of the stations under my command was Gloucester Station. I had 5 of them, but Gloucester was the one where I spent most of my time. So I had a very tight relationship with a lot of people in Gloucester. Maybe some are online tonight, people like Anja Sanfilippo, Safathia, who's now the mayor of Gloucester, Bruce Tarr, who's a senator for that area, Tony Verga, who is retired now. Hopefully, I think he's still alive. The harbor master. Had a very tight relationship, but we had a case where a fishing vessel, a Gloucester fishing vessel, put out an EPIRB. I'll try to keep some of these simple because I could go on forever. But an EPIRB is an emergency position indicating beacon, and we responded rapidly. Canadian Coast Guard got there. There was no vessel. The vessel had obviously sunk. The Canadian aircraft was the first on scene. This was just to the north and west of, north and east of Provincetown. The vessel sank. The Canadian Coast Guard, just to me, happened in the area doing some more search and rescue. This vessel sank almost instantly. 4 people on board, and all of them were lost. That's a bad day, particularly when you have to sit down with a family, which I did with Bruce Tarr and with Angela, I think was there with us, sat down, talked to them about it. There are families of Gloucester fishermen, hardy families. They understand the risk of going to sea, but it was difficult. We found the vessel finally several months later. The Italian Gold was the name of it. It was found as we saw it went down off of Cape Cod, north and east of Cape Cod. Coincidentally, history repeats itself. Last year, 2020, a couple months ago, just before Thanksgiving, the Emma Rose, almost exactly the same situation, sank. These were professionals, good boats, professionals, but things happen at sea. Seas come up, rogue wave periodically, possibly bad weather, fishermen taking a little bit more of a risk possibly than they should because they're trying to make a living. Sad, but these 4 fishermen are also lost. These are tragic events. But let me go on. Cape Cod, Nantucket Sound. Summer day, look out here and say, geez, there's no risk there. Nice sandy beaches, little waves wafting in, water temperature pretty good. If you run aground, you kind of walk ashore, swim ashore, not a big problem. Well, that's not when we have problems. It's during the winter time. It's when the big storm, the nor'easter, comes in. And understand, when you're on a ship, particularly a wooden ship, it runs aground. This is not just wooden ships, but on every ship. When it runs aground, it's very vulnerable. If there's a large wave, the waves are powerful and can break the ship apart very fast. Nantucket Sound doesn't have the large waves that you have off of the outer part of the Cape, but they still get pretty good sized waves. Fortunately, it's surrounded by land and cuts down some of the biggest waves coming in, but can still be a very dangerous area. In fact, I wanted to talk for a second about why Cape Cod, the graveyard in North Atlantic? Why so many shipwrecks here? But first, why are there shipwrecks? What causes shipwrecks? I forget what my next slide is here. I don't want to, this is some examples of bad days. One of the most outstanding ones here was the November of 1898 when the Portland storm, ominously named Portland because the vessel Portland, motor vessel Portland, sank again just north of Cape Cod. Some of the bodies drifted ashore near Provincetown. All the people on board were lost, about 400 people. It was a vessel leaving from Boston, going to Portland, Maine, carrying passengers up there. Tragic. There were another up to 400 vessels that were lost. You'd think we'd know how many exactly. It wasn't that long ago, 125 years ago, but we don't. A lot more lost and gone forever. It's just hard to count. Whole families were lost. It was a major event. Cape Cod Canal, talking about traffic, I'll get into this in a little bit later, but traffic coming by the Cape and coming through Nantucket Sound can be significant. These are just one example. In 1843 through 1860, you can see the numbers here. They counted the number of vessels that were lost. This was part of the justification for the Cape Cod Canal. Turned out they didn't build it until 49 years later. During that time, another 900 ships were wrecked. What causes shipwrecks? Basically, I could be sarcastic and say all of it's human error. Can you predict bad weather? No, it's difficult. Are there rogue conditions that come up? Yes, but the human race hasn't evolved, came out of the ocean, hasn't evolved now to the point of being able to live in the ocean. It's a hostile environment to us generally. We can't live, hypothermia, swimming. It's just an environment that's hostile to us. So anytime there's anything that happens on board a boat or at the ocean, even swimming with great whites, we're very vulnerable. But there are mistakes that are made that may be human error, maybe due to other, I'll talk about a few in a few minutes, but navigational mistakes going aground, equipment failures, vessels burning up, for example, collisions, hostility, obviously wartime, coastal hazards are many, particularly around Cape Cod. And then there is, why is Cape Cod a graveyard? Some of the challenges relate to vessels prior to the start of the 20th century. The topography is challenging today as it was back eons ago for vessels navigating around the Cape. This is a picture of Nantucket Sound. The blue, quickly, if you look at blue, darker the blue, the shallower the water. Not an easy area to go through. And be frank with you, these blue areas are shifting around all the time with storms coming through. The circle up in the upper right-hand corner is what I'm going to show on the next slide. This is the end of Monomoy Island, south of Chatham. You can see depth of water there. Those shaded areas, those speckled areas are shoals. If you look carefully, and I'll try to do it with this with my pointer here, you can see a shipping lane coming in here, coming down to a lightship that was there from the early 1830s, late 1820s up until the last lightship disappeared, was removed or decommissioned in 1985. But there was a lightship here, the Pollock Rip lightship. So vessels will come in, turn right at the lightship, come to this other lightship, turn left, come down here, and then come into Nantucket Sound through Handkerchief lightship. Another story about why it's named Handkerchief I won't get to tonight, but it wasn't easy getting into Nantucket Sound. So heavy marine traffic was another issue. What you see here is a chart from a modern chart that shows the shipping lanes coming out of Boston and in New York, coming around the Cape. Heavily trafficked, not as heavily trafficked commercial traffic today as it was back in the 1800s, but still a lot of traffic. This was the interstate highway system for the United States until Eisenhower built what he built in the 50s with the paved highways. But a lot of our traffic, passenger moving, cargo moving, was coming from along these routes all around Cape Cod. This is ice from Maine. I own a place up on the coast of Maine that is a freshwater area that ice was produced, put on schooners and brought down through here, probably brought through Nantucket Sound to feed the ice needs of New York, Baltimore, Philly, those places. Bad weather. I'm going to take a second here, excuse me for this poor graphics. I'm not a real graphic person. And also excuse the fact that my background is my graduate degrees were in oceanography, physical oceanography, which is essentially meteorology applied to the ocean, and also in another one in business administration. But the oceanography part begs me to tell a little bit about what makes this a challenging area. First of all, you have a Labrador current, remnants of a Labrador current coming down along the coast of Nova Scotia, cold water, essentially. You have the Gulf Stream, what's called the North Atlantic Current, once it gets up here along the continental shelf, which is shown here. Those come together and they produce, as you would expect, fog, warm, moist air coming over cold water. So it's an area that's prone to have a lot of fog in it. And Nantucket Sound certainly isn't immune to this, you know. In addition, we have weather systems to come through, nor'easters, particularly tragic to marine traffic, because what happens in a nor'easter, as you can see, a low pressure coming up the coast, often coming up from the Hatteras area, coming up, slowing down, getting caught in here. You've got the warm water here, cold water here. Often it will get slowed down a little bit in that area. That causes weather in the form of storms and the form of waves. There are three things that create large waves, pretty logical. One is the wind speed. The higher wind speed, the higher waves will get generally. The duration, how long the wind acts in the water, and the fetch, that the wind is coming in the same direction. For example, here, the wind is coming out of the Bay of Fundy, in this particular example, a low pressure here in the center. And it's over a very long fetch of several hundred miles. If the low pressure is there for 12, 24, 36 hours, a long time, and a wind speed of 40, 50, 60 knots, there are going to be some large waves that hit the area here. Some of that trickles into Long Island Sound and certainly outer part of the Long Island Sound and to Nantucket Sound. You're also prone from a shipwreck perspective. If you're coming out of New York or coming out here up the coast, coming up here, if you're in a square riggers, and I apologize for those that are sailors, I'm not going to get into too much detail, but those that haven't done any sailing, a square rigger doesn't go into the wind very well. It can go, if this were the wind direction coming down here, a square rigger can go upwind some, but it can't go into the wind. So if you're coming up here and you have a nor'easter and get caught, you get pushed ashore here. And all the shipwrecks that have occurred up here in the Peaks Hill area, Peaks Hill Bar, Truro, Provincetown, significant, including men of war. The Somerset during the Revolutionary War went aground there. Another story that's fascinating. I won't go into it. I'd have to repeat some of Paul Revere's Midnight Ride to get the full emphasis of the Somerset. But that said, this is a stormy area and weather plays a part in that. Excuse my French here for those that know this, but fog is a major issue in Nantucket Sound, particularly in the spring and early summer. Now throughout the year, frankly, fog's bad. I've had a lot of friends that have been on lightships and they say that's life on a lightship is being in a fog. If you haven't figured it out yet, Fagawi, just look it up. You'll figure it out. I won't go into the translation. Next is no ship-to-shore communications. This is prior to the turn of the century, 19th century, so you couldn't call. You'd have EPIRBs and other things to warn people. Lack of response resources. That was a challenge. There's no one out there to help you, particularly prior to the 1800s. You were on your own. The first shipwreck that occurred that we know of, and that wreck still exists, frankly, we have the remnants of it, is the Sparrowhawk. Came over in 1626, got to Nantucket Sound, decided to go a little further north, went aground in Orleans, and never made it back from there. The people got ashore. No one was lost, but the Pilgrims helped out. They had been there for 6 years up in Plymouth. This wreck still exists. Right now, it's held up in Plymouth at the Pilgrim Society has it. It's been down here at Cape on display. It's the oldest surviving shipwreck in the United States. Interesting in that it was, and we'll get to this in a second, it was a victim of navigation. They didn't really know where they were. And several other things. They were out of water. They had been at sea for a long time. The captain had scurvy, various things. I put this vessel in not because it's Cape Cod related, but to emphasize how regulations would change over time. The Austria was in the North Atlantic, quite a ways from here, 1850s, 58. One of the bosuns was had a practice. The ship was only a year old, by the way. Had many people on board, which I'll get to in a second once I find the number. It had 642 people on board. The bosun had a chain that he would dip in tar and then have it, the hot chain, and take it back and put it in the steerage area to fumigate it. There was an issue with rats and other vermin. Unfortunately, the chain got too hot, dropped it on deck, and set the whole vessel on fire. Also, the crew in the engine room died almost immediately from the smoke. So they lost the engines. The steerage, the helmsman abandoned ship very early on, so they couldn't steer it. And it turned into the wind and the fire got out of control, and 89 people survived. The rest of the 642 died. The reason I mention this is we hopefully learn from these mistakes. The U.S. developed just at about this time, a few years before, it's just emphasized the steamship inspection service. This was a steamship, and it led to new regulations and made for a safer environment. I'm going to spend a few minutes on just a couple of shipwrecks. This one is one that's particularly important. The city of Columbus, that's the name of the ship, it's also a city, obviously, but 1884, this was a relatively new ship, a couple of years old, great ship. It was a vessel that was going from Boston to Savannah on a weekly, maybe a bi-weekly basis. I'm not sure how many times they made the round trip. It would come down out of Boston along the outer part of the Cape, cut its way down through the Nantucket Sound, come down through Vineyard Sound, and then continue on to Savannah. The captain was a captain from Harwich. He had, I think, 29 years experience, very experienced. The other officers on board, Cape Codders, very experienced, very capable vessel, not a problem. At least at this point it wasn't. So they got down, got safely through, made it all the way through, which they did every time, through Nantucket Sound, going by all the light ships and so forth that were there. Came down Vineyard Sound, and the captain at that point had been up since early in the morning the previous day. This was at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and went down to didn't go down to his cabin. His cabin was right behind the pilot house. He was within feet of the cabin, but just decided to sit down with his back to the heater that was there, and gave the first officer on board the guidance to continue down in the track. When you get a beam of the Tarpon Cove light, change your course to the right by a certain number of degrees and continue down. Well, as you can see with this track here, he didn't turn. And the vessel kept going and hit Devil's Bridge, ledge or Devil's Bridge shoal, whichever you call it. That wasn't good. It was a cold night, windy night, pretty good visibility. The vessel ran hard aground. I can't go on all the details of it. It's really tragic. I'll just mention a few things. This was at about 3:45 at night. Again, nobody around. There was a lighthouse. The Gayhead Lighthouse was nearby. They noticed them first thing in the morning, as soon as first light, and started to send rescue vessels out about 7 o'clock. Now, again, this is 3 hours, 3.5 hours later that the first rescue people attempted to get there. The vessel was in trouble from the beginning once it ran aground. The captain first thought he'd back it off the shoal. That was a mistake. It just took on more water and sank more rapidly. The other mistake he made, although this is fairly standard practice, he got all the passengers, women and children particularly. There were 132 people on board, many of them women and children. They were going to vacation. This was February, going vacation in Savannah. They got out on deck. The captain called them on deck to get them in life rafts, and they're already in life jackets. And just at that time, a big breaker wave hit, washed them all overboard. None of the women and children on board survived. There were only 25, I think, altogether people that survived this. And rescues were still going on the next midday, 12, early afternoon. So they're in this is February, remember? This is pretty frigid water. Think of being out in in this area, Vineyard Sound, at that time of year. And it was tragic. The heroic rescues by the life-saving service. This was the Mass Humane Society at the time. Wampanoag tribe Indians coming out doing many of the rescues. The revenue cutter Dexter came by at about noon, on the way back from patrol. Since there weren't radios and so forth, they weren't aware of this. They kind of stumbled upon it. They rescued quite a few people, some heroic rescues, and that Lieutenant Rhodes, for example, did some amazing rescues. In fact, President Chester Arthur did a special citation to him for the rescues that he did, but still there was a lot of loss of life. This is one of my, by the way, part of the crew. This is the Wampanoag Mass Humane Society. I think it's this gentleman right here is the great-grandfather of a good friend of mine, a Wampanoag, Edith Andrews. She's in her late 70s, early 80s right now. Part of the crew that went out to do the rescue. Dexter, I just mentioned. I love this photograph because it shows the Coast Guard. As I mentioned earlier, the Coast Guard didn't really take on the name of Coast Guard, didn't really start to merge with the other services until 1915. This was the 1884. But if you see up in the distance on the top of the cliff there is the lighthouse service, the Gay Head Light, which called the disaster in, if you will, called the boat crews to go out. The Humane Society, which became the U.S. Life-Saving Service, which became the Coast Guard, has shown they're doing rescues. And then the vessel in the foreground is the decks of the revenue cutter. So this was the Coast Guard before it was the Coast Guard, if you will. All these organizations eventually came together in another couple decades to become the Coast Guard. I could spend a lot of time on this, but I'm running short on time right now. It was a tragic event. A lot of press coverage, for example, dead kids laying out on a tugboat in New Bedford were featured on the front page of the New York and Boston papers. I won't go into the Titanic, except that, again, the tragedy of the Titanic was changes in safety and security. The Titanic led to a major SOLAS agreement. SOLAS stands for Safety of Life at Sea, that led to how many life rafts you had, all the stuff that you know about the Titanic, the safety issues. Titanic was a great vessel, but it had some shortcomings, and many of those have been resolved. It led to the International Ice Patrol and affect my life too, as I said. These are some other vessels. I really can't spend much time on this. I'm running short. The Andrea Doria, the Pendleton, Argo Merchant. Hopefully you're familiar with most of these. These are all just south of Nantucket, with the exception of the Pendleton, which is off of Monomoy and Chatham. These were significant shipwrecks. The Argo Merchant, for example, was a terrible vessel condition-wise. In fact, I have something here. It says that it was named to the worst ship list of books in the heroic failure book, whatever the heroic failure book is. It was terrible. Radars weren't working. People weren't qualified. It ran aground with 7.7 million gallons of oil on it. Saved the crew. The ship broke up. All nearly 8 million gallons were dispersed in the ocean. It would have been a major environmental disaster for Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, the Cape, if not for Mother Nature. Mother Nature just at that time had a wind blowing out of the northwest, and all this. It was a slick that was 100 by 60 nautical miles in size, was blown out to sea and dispersed out there. It did some environmental damage, obviously, but it would have been much more disaster. Andrea Doria, again, I could go on forever. My wife's grandmother was supposed to be on that particular cruise. She decided to fly back instead. The Pendleton, very close and dear to our heart. Or Bernie Weber, the guy involved in that rescue, was very much involved with the establishment of our museum, the Coast Guard Heritage Museum in Barnstable. Response, again, I won't go through all this, but there have been a lot of safety advances, navigation, clearly, naval architecture, better designed vessels, power made a difference, obviously. The old sailing ships couldn't power themselves out of bad situations. Better response resources, better boats and aircraft to go out to help. Weather forecasting, you may not believe this, but weather forecasting has got significantly better than it was back 100 years ago. I won't go into too much detail here. I was going to start early on with Harrison, but there are significant navigational improvements. Harrison is the guy that invented the marine chronometer. It led to understanding longitude and understanding better where you were. Looking back at the Sparrowhawk, which I showed there, that went aground in 1826, it had a pretty good idea what latitude it was on. It had no idea where it was longitude-wide across the ocean. Complicated also by the fact that because around here you don't see the celestial navigation because of fog is a little harder to do. But that's an interesting story on its own, is Harrison and some of his legacy. This was all in the 1700s. Going on, this is some of his watches that were that developed. I won't go into that. Lighthouses, part of the response to shipwrecks. The Mass Humane Society, lighthouses, lightships, AIDS navigation, all came in to respond to disasters. This is a listing, look at the lightships that existed in the mid to late 1800s in Nantucket Sound. You can see the approaches here, some of these up in here. The ships coming down, you would see come down the ship I was just talking about with the city of Columbus, had to come down here by Pollock Rip, come through here by Handkerchief Shoals, come down by Cross Rip and go over here by Hedge, get through there. And they did. I should read quickly, just if I can find it here and find my glasses. I will read quickly. The port or the sailing chart from 1859 talked about this area, meaning Nantucket Sound and areas right around. The shoals are so numerous about this locality that descriptions would be useless, and enumeration would only tend to confuse. No stranger should attempt their navigation except by the main shipping channel without a pilot. Even the most perfect chart is extremely hazardous. Again, as I mentioned before, these shoals are moving around all the time with storms. It's a dangerous area, and it's a dangerous today. Cross Rip's light, again, I want to give some time for questions in a minute or two, but Cross Rip was one of the lightships that was lost. It was right in the middle of Cape Cod, in Nantucket Sound, was washed out to sea during an ice. It was caught in the ice, and a tragic story. I wish I had time to go through that a little bit more. Nantucket lightship run over by the sister ship of the Titanic. All 9 of the 12 crew were lost. This was the ship that ran over it. Strangely, this was a picture taken off by the Nantucket lightship about 2 or 3 months before the ship ran over the top of it. This ship was 75 times larger than the lightship. Lightships were notoriously dangerous for Coast Guard people. Probably the most dangerous duty existed because they would flip and fall when they're getting on and off the ship. They'd get run over and caught in ice and die. This is a light we have at the museum from the Vineyard Sound lightship. It went down in 1944 in a hurricane. No one survived again. Everyone on board was lost. This is the only remnant that I'm aware of. One of the few remnants from the ship is at our museum. Surf boats came in, the technology advanced to something now today with helicopters and boats. Technology for the mariner itself, obviously satellites, radar. Royal Majesty, there are 3 just to mention in passing here. I won't get into it, but I want to spend a little more time on this. Another time, possibly. The Royal Majesty, a particularly interesting, a high-tech, modern ship, 3 years old at the time. All the technology you can imagine still ran aground on Rosicrucian Shoal because there was a navigational error, human error again, but they had there was a problem that they experienced. This one you may remember just to celebrate its anniversary, its 10th anniversary, a little ways from here, but again, a human error. And then finally, the Iona, which was the ferry that ran aground in Nantucket, coming over from Nantucket to Hyannis. You can see the breakwater here. They were coming up. This was complacency, which is something to be careful about with shipwrecks. Complacency, comfort level, not to get too comfortable. This went up, ran aground here on the bar. You can see it sitting on a breakwater here. Experienced captains, very high-tech navigation equipment. Captains with over 60 years experience, the 2 together, the 2 captains on board. they just became a little bit too comfortable and they missed it. There were a lot of other reasons for it, but it was basically, in my mind, complacency and comfort, carelessness. All right, I'm turning it back to Audrey. I thank you, Audrey.
Great. Thank you, Greg. That was wonderful. I learned a lot. And we do have a number of questions from the audience. So first question from Bill is, are there any sonar scans on current location of shipwrecks?
Of shipwrecks in general? Oh, many of them. Many of shipwrecks there. One example I'll give is the Andrea Doria. We know exactly where that is. It's in very, very deep water. It has become the Titanic for divers, frankly. We've lost, I think, 26 divers diving on the wreck of the Andrea Doria because it's such deep water over the last, well, it's been 50 years now since it's been down there. So yes, we have all sorts of shipwrecks. There are 3,000 or more shipwrecks off of Cape Cod, another 3,000 to 5,000 off of Cape Hatteras too. There a plethora would be an understatement of shipwrecks and sonar stuff.
Okay. Greg, I don't know if you just turned your video off or if it's.
I didn't. I think it may have been Peter, but either way.
Oh, okay. Another question. What is the single most common cause of shipwrecks?
Well, I'd be cute by saying it's human error, but I'm not sure there is a common navigational errors, I suppose. But today there's no excuse for that. There's such great navigation. So miscalculation, being out there in weather, fishermen that are professionals get caught too because they are hold on one second. I might be able to do something different here.
Yeah, I think if you, there you go. You're back. Perfect.
Were you hearing me? I think my audio was still
on.
on.
No, we were hearing you, just not seeing you.
So if I were to guess, weather is maybe the biggest part, weather, waves, the biggest danger.
Okay. Paul's asking, is navigation through Nantucket Sound still as difficult as you mentioned it was earlier?
Oh, it's certainly not as difficult as it was 20 or even 30 or 40 years, 20 years ago. 30, 40 was much more difficult because of GPS. It's much more navigable, but just as an aside, I mentioned the Royal Majesty coming up from Bermuda when it ran aground off of Nantucket back in the 80s or back in the 90s. It had the most sophisticated navigation you can imagine. Backup, LORAN, computer, GPS, all that. There was an equipment failure. It turned out that the GPS wasn't hooked up correctly. It came loose, the wire came loose. It happens, to use that expression. So the answer is, it's much easier with the right equipment to get through the sound, but you're still prone to bad weather. It's still a very difficult area to navigate through unless you're experienced. So I guess the answer would be, yes, it's still difficult, but not as hazardous as it was.
Okay. Somebody's asking if it's possible to see this session again somewhere, and they found it very interesting, and I can answer that for you. We're recording it, and we will post it up on our website, on the saveoursound.org website. It should be up there by tomorrow.
And I will add, come to the museum. This is just one of the many, many stories. I will say one quick thing. You may not realize, for example, it's a whole different story, that the first aircraft to fly across the Atlantic Ocean departed from Cape Cod and was piloted by a Coast Guard pilot in 1919, 8 years before Lindbergh. Those stories are, we have all sorts of stories like that. So if you, shipwrecks, whatever, aircraft, come on over. We'll talk to you.
You know, I have to admit, I have passed that museum many times and I have not stopped, but I definitely will now. I've always thought that building was just a really beautiful building. So I will be stopping there. Brenda says, not a question, but thank you for your service.
Thank you. It was fun. I feel guilty about that. I had a very rewarding career. But thank you.
Well, that's a nice thing when you have a rewarding career and you enjoy it. So John is asking if you could talk about the QE2. No.
Okay. I should say I know about the QE2. I don't know a whole lot about it. So I think it's unfair for me to go off too much on the QE2. It's not, it's modern cruise ship, obviously, and has a lot of good things going for it. So other than that, I really don't have much insight to give on the QE2.
Okay. Well, there's plenty of other questions. So what aspects of Nantucket Sound make it especially vulnerable or susceptible to shipwrecks?
Well, it's the bathymetry, I would say, more than anything else. Well, it's bathymetry and weather, fog, the Fagawi trait is that the fog, low visibility, weather doesn't get the gigantic waves that you experience, as I said before, that you have further offshore. But the shifting shoals, I don't need to say that 10 times fast, but the shoals are moving around. You have a major storm that comes through and the whole bathymetry changes there. So that makes it particularly dangerous too. And it's pretty shallow, frankly. It's not just Nantucket shoals, it's all the shoals, not just Nantucket Sound, but it's Nantucket shoals south of Nantucket. We had a lightship, as you know, the Nantucket lightship that was, 15 miles south of Nantucket to mark the southern extreme of that. So many shipwrecks out there too.
Sherry is saying, great talk, especially for Bob Donahue here from Coast Guard Academy, 1956. He joined to sail on the square rigger Eagle. Didn't the Queen Elizabeth go aground too?
Yes. When I was teaching at the Coast Guard Academy, if you have questions like that, I'd say, very good question. Why don't you look that up and get back to us and we can discuss it more tomorrow? Because I didn't have the answer. I don't know what the answer is to the Queen Elizabeth.
I'm just going to keep asking you the same question just to stump you.
Yeah, I just hit the right vessel. Right. I can talk about it, but the QE2 and Queen Elizabeth, I'm not. Generally, I can give some comments on it, but it's not much value.
I'm going to give you a very easy one now then, okay?
Okay, good.
Ron is softball. Softball, exactly. I was trying to think of what it was. All I could think of was like low ball, and I knew that wasn't right. So Ron is asking, where is the museum?
Well, it's in Barnstable Village. It's in the old customs house built in 1856, a great building. The building itself, I've given lectures just on that building. Architecturally, it was a Renaissance change, a Victorian change. It's a Italianate building. So it's a great building on its own. But we have that as the jail is there, the old carriage house is there. I could give tours just on the building itself, but we're in Barnstable Village, just up the hill to the east of the main village from the where the courthouse is. We're about a quarter mile from the courthouse. Okay.
Another question, why was the Coast Guard part of Treasury originally in the 1700s?
Well, the origins of Coast Guard go back to the Revenue Cutter Service as one of the organizations, which was formed in 1790. And it was done to help with the Customs Service. It was formed the year before to collect revenue. It was our only source of revenue. So Hamilton is considered the father of the Coast Guard with his being a Secretary of Treasury. And it goes back to Treasury and stayed with Treasury. It became, by the time we get into the mid 20th century, it was clear that that was not the right place for it. And then with the new transportation department, it made more sense going over there. But our origins go back to the customs and the revenue cutter. When I was commissioned officer in the Coast Guard, believe it or not, back in 1970, I was also given the authorities of a customs officer. I've never had a reason to use it, but so customs, Treasury, they're all tied together there. A whole bunch of our ships, the Hamilton and so forth, we've had the Dallas, all named after secretaries of Treasury.
Okay. Kate is asking, what impact would offshore wind towers or other structures have on navigating Nantucket Sound and or on shifting sands in the shoals?
Well, I promise that navigating the ferries, the booze cruises, if you will, that go through, that I think they would not be too prone to collisions there because they operate all the time. Fishing vessels the same way. Concerns over that. What is the impact of the fishing ground of tower? Any tower? What would be the impact on fishing? That's still to be determined. There's one argument that says that they could provide a habitat for breeding for fish. Another says, well, it's difficult for fishermen. So without giving my opinion one way or the other, I'll suggest that the existence of additional structure is built out in the Nantucket Sound. There is modern things that can occur that would eliminate, or not, I'd be very careful about this, that would reduce the hazard. hazards are always going to be there. And no matter what you do, you can say that you have great navigational tools now, and thus you're not bound to run into anything. But again, stuff happens, to use the
Right,
French.
like
and,
the ferry accident, the recent ferry accident that you talked about that ran into the Hyannisport breaker.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to wrap up. I have one more question, which is, because we're hitting 7 o'clock, is Nantucket Sound a significant risk to pleasure boaters?
Well, my comment is, anytime you go to sea, it could be just going out in the harbor. It's a risk to pleasure boaters. So hopefully part of the issue with doing work with the Coast Guard Auxiliary that works with us in educating people. People that just jump in a boat and go out thinking that's open water don't have any idea that there are changes of depth in the water. They can go aground anywhere. I mean, I've run into that, or get a placemat that is taken from a ship and use that for navigation. Yes, there are always hazards there to uninformed, inexperienced boaters, but generally care is needed. Go out in the right weather, check the weather forecast. If you want to file a float plan with your relatives, for example, to make sure that, sort of like you do an aircraft, to say, here's where I'm planning to go in case you have a mechanical problem. But, a pleasure boater out in the middle of Nantucket Sound runs out of gas or has an engine failure, a storm is coming through, clearly there's risk. I have spent a fair amount of time out there over the years. It's comfortable. I didn't mention it, I followed on a career with the Coast Guard as the director up at the England Aquarium in Boston. And we had things going on in Nantucket Sound there. So I have a lot of contact with that environment. It's a great area. Love it.
Well, Greg, we are out of time, but I very much appreciate you joining us today. It was very interesting. And I'm sure if anyone has any additional questions, I can get them to you and I can get them back to the audience. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
So I hope everyone here has a greater appreciation of Nantucket Sound from other perspectives. And we thank you for joining us. And if you need any more information, just go to saveoursound.org. Stay in touch with us. You can reach me at audra@saveoursound.org. And we have, follow us on social media as well. And if you do want to help and support our efforts to designate Nantucket Sound as a National Historic Landmark, I urge you to go to our website and sign the petition at saveoursound.org/petition. And we've gotten well over 1,000 people that have weighed in so far. So please add your voice, and we hope to see you next month at our next webinar. So have a great evening. Thank you.